Welcome back to the course, Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. We are now at lesson 14, titled How to Raise Revenue for Public Goods and Services. The ideal tax policy toward business is clear, to me at least. Production and commerce ought to be encouraged and left unburdened by taxation, while at the same time pushing businesses to maximize their use of the locations and natural resource lands under their control. As previously discussed, what this means is that taxes paid to government ought to equate to the annual rental value of such locations as well as natural resource lands that people control. Broadly defined, the exploitation of land includes aspects of nature not widely appreciated. This would include licenses to control part of the broadcast spectrum, licenses to take fish from the oceans, or even the takeoff and landing slots allocated by airports. Land would then no longer be wasted, as is the case today, and we would actually be raising public revenue that belongs to society rather than by taxation of what we individually produce and which ought to be treated as our private property. If the need for government revenue exceeds the combined total rental value of all land and natural resources, any additional taxes ought to create the most level playing field possible. Existing business taxes tend to penalize success and reward failure. The greater a business's expenses and the lower its declared profit, the lower are the taxes levied. I submit that a more efficient approach is to impose a low but graduated tax on gross revenue, exempting some level of revenue for all businesses. In doing so, the impact on businesses with heavy expenses will be greater than on those with lower expenses. Businesses will then be encouraged by the tax system to maintain a firm control over expenses. Firms would no longer receive tax advantages as a result of their borrowing and would therefore borrow only on the basis of sound business reasons. A firm's physical assets, including plant and equipment, would no longer be taxed, nor would depreciation taken as an expense play a role in the calculation of taxable income. From the standpoint of the public interest, no longer would an army of government auditors be paid to assure compliance with tax laws. The same principles of just taxation and economic efficiency apply to the individual as well as to companies. Cooperative individualism serves as the basis for human rights applied to property. Thus, our birthright as human beings is the right of equal access to the earth. Titles to nature and other forms of license that restrict equal access create unnatural forms of property, privileges that are inherently monopolistic. Our natural right to property comes, on the other hand, from what we produce by applying our labor to nature, and thereafter by the use of capital goods and by trade. Justice demands that government protect our right to use and or dispose of our property as we choose, so long as in doing so we do not infringe on the rights of others. These moral principles do not apply to nature because nature is not produced by us. What this means is that taxation of actual private property or of income derived from the use of property is a form of confiscation. Justice demands, however, that the individual compensate all others in society for the privilege of monopolizing access to any location and natural resource received under titles or licenses. Let us suppose that all individuals and all other groups who control nature are contributing the full rental value attached to these privileges, that holders are competing under the auction function of the market for titles and licenses. Let us suppose further that by consensus and in accord with democratic principles, a majority of citizens agree that additional public goods ought to be provided and revenue raised to produce such goods. What should be the guiding principle for the confiscation by taxation of the legitimate property of individuals? Here is where ability to pay ought to be given highest consideration. One approach is to institute a graduated tax that exempts all individuals who earn below a certain level, say the median income in any given year. Above that income, a graduated rate would be applied that increases up to a maximum on very high marginal incomes. To provide a basis for discussion, I offer the following example of how this would work in the United States. Incomes up to the $50,000 level of individual incomes would be exempt. That's the starting point. Incomes of $50,001 up to $100,000 would be taxed at 5%. Then incomes of $100,001 to $250,000 would be taxed at 10%. So far, this is still pretty modest taxation for significantly high incomes. Then incomes of $250,001 up to $500,000 would be taxed at 15%. And then incomes of $500,001 to $1 million would be taxed at 20%. The rates applied to higher ranges of income would be calculated based on a commitment to balancing the budget and all sources of revenue forecasted to be raised by taxation and other means would be included in that determination. To be sure, there is confiscation associated with this supplemental means of raising public revenue. However, the depth of confiscation is moderate and would not, under the application of reasonableness secured by means of democratic process, materially impact the individual's capacity to consume. What about our duty to protect the environment? We have excelled in the exploitation of the Earth's resources for immediate gratification and short-term survival. What many of us now realize is that our behavior has been and continues to be damaging in the extreme to the operation of the Earth as an ecosystem. To continue on as we have is little short of suicidal behavior. Pollution and overfishing threaten to destroy the food chain in the oceans and freshwater seas. Heavy use of herbicides and pesticides poison the land and inland waterways with toxic chemicals that are consumed by animals and enter our own food supply. Subsurface and strip mining operations pour even more chemicals into groundwater supplies as well. And the burning of fossil fuels turns our air into poisonous vapor. And then there is the byproduct of energy generated by nuclear reactors. This is a vast storehouse of radioactive waste for which no safe means of storage has yet been found. If we have any reason for optimism, it is that a wide range of non-governmental groups are focusing time and resources on these problems. On the other side, despite a quarter century of activism and the passage of sweeping regulations, the effort to make our activities environmentally sensitive continues to be thwarted by individuals, businesses, and even governments acting to protect short-term profits, privileges, and political power. Clearly, the struggle to heal and preserve our ecosystem requires mobilization of the global citizenry on a scale never before achieved. Steps are being taken in this direction, and considerable examples of progress can be pointed to within many societies, as well as global cooperation among nations. At issue then is how to more effectively shift the balance of power in favor of our long-term survival. Once again, an understanding of the economics of taxation will direct us to press for a dramatic overhaul in the way we raise revenue for public use, with material benefits accruing to the health of our ecosystem. Societies are faced with the choice of whether title holders to nature are to be permitted to build personal fortunes on the basis of location and natural resource speculation and control, or acknowledge the access they are guaranteed as a privilege for which society as a whole is to be legitimately compensated. As Professor Fred Foldvari states in this paper, the public collection of land rent is the ultimate tax reform. When the tax base equates to the annual rental value of land, permitted uses will determine the amount a potential user will be willing to pay for access. For example, tracts of land in areas with strong and consistent winds have experienced dramatic increases in rental value with the development of wind farm technology. But some communities oppose the wind farms because of their accompanying negative impacts on the quality of life. If the cost of cleaning up the environment is left to society after the fact, the amount of rent users will pay for access unencumbered by regulations will be higher, but government will then have the higher revenue to use for remedial efforts. Common sense suggests that prevention is the wiser policy, even at the cost of less public revenue being generated. Water and sewerage systems are a primary example of how economies of scale are realized by centralized systems. Yet, as technology changes, it may become more efficient to adopt self-contained systems that remove and treat waste at the source. Regulations imposing a zero pollution standard on the extraction of and refining of fossil fuels or natural gas would drive down the annual rental value of fossil fuel bearing lands, but would go a long way to protect our environment. That's the end of Lesson 14.